coordination began visually. It's what I visualized as I got into the field as a doctoral student and was interested in how people work together. And I guess one of my first questions was really how do frontline people somehow influence the strategic decisions of their company. But I got much more interested at what's happening at this across themselves horizontally, how they engage and coordinate complex work. Went on to study that in other contexts, but what struck me about this as I interviewed people and really heard what they were doing and not just watched what they were doing, but heard them make sense of it, is that the ties were much easier to build within areas of homogeneity and within a work group, and harder to build across. And that might have something to do with how we are wired as human beings to be more, what is Hermie called homophily, to be more, but I think it's also how organizations are designed to reinforce those silos, because that's the structure we've inherited. But I came to see that the coordination, both within those bubbles and across, is very much shaped by relationships that shape the communication through which the coordination happens, and that happens in different dynamics. It's not relationships necessarily of which individuals like or get along with each other, although maybe by default that's sometimes what drives it, but the degree of goal alignment across roles, the degree of system understanding, shared knowledge, and the degree of perceived respect for the role of the other seem to be driving sufficiently frequent, timely, accurate, and problem-solving communication and being that positive cycle. But I also saw the other end of the continuum, and of course we know most organizations are somewhere in between, with some of the ties are very strong, some are weak, and so on. And as they said in Denmark, it depends on the day of the week, where we are on this continuum. But you also have the tendency toward this more fragmented relationships where the ties between those bubbles are very weak and characterized by strictly functional goals, only specialized knowledge without the benefit of the system's perspective, and perceived lack of respect for each other's work, driving insufficiently frequent, often delayed, inaccurate, and more finger-pointing communication when things go wrong. And that tends to be a downward spiral as well. A downward spiral, whereas the other one is each one has a certain inertia of its own that's hard to break out of, for better or worse. And I called that relational coordination, which you can define in many ways, but one is communicating and relating for the purpose of task integration. And basically gets at the relational dynamics through which complex work is coordinated or not. And it seems like this is particularly important. It was theorized too, and it's been tested. The contingency or boundary conditions have been tested a bit, that it's particularly important for achieving performance outcomes when you don't have simply a pooled interdependence where, we share a common resource, but we don't have really handoffs, or even a sequential interdependence where the handoffs go in one direction, but rather when the interdependence is reciprocal, where I depend on you for some output and you depend on me, so that it's a tighter interdependence. And this starts to get into other definitions of complexity that we will hear today. When there's uncertainty and fairly high levels, so we can't completely predict what's going to happen from moment to moment, so we have to adapt and adjust on the fly, and again to each other, because we're also interdependent, and we don't have all the time in the world. There's some kind of time constraint where we can't sit down and figure it out from scratch every time, so that we're doing this and carrying out this work under some kind of time constraint. And those conditions together create a complexity and greater value for developing this capability called relational coordination. So there have been identified a set of structures that are different